We have a definition of what a man is at Undaunted Life. It's a male, which you shouldn't even have to define that, but here we are, a male that cultivates spiritual, mental, and physical resilience daily.
Welcome to the Ryan Holmes podcast, where we exist to encourage Christian thinking and Christian living. This week, I'm excited to bring you the episode that we have for you. My guest is Kyle Thompson, and he is the host of Undaunted Life, a man's podcast. And he was gracious enough to give me just a few minutes of his time to jump on today and allow me to ask him some questions about masculinity, the church. We talked about toxic masculinity, and there's a lot of subjects in there that we did touch on, and I think you're really going to enjoy this podcast. Guys, if you're listening, I encourage you to go check out his work and his podcast. It'll be a help to you and an encouragement to you. And don't forget to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or a positive review on whatever listening platform you might be listening to. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. That will be linked in the show notes below. And if you have any questions about today's episode or Kyle himself and his work, send me an email to ryanhomespodcast@gmail.com. But without further ado, we're gonna jump over to this conversation that I had with Kyle, and I hope you enjoy. I'm very excited about our guest this week, and I'm thankful that he chose to come on the podcast and talk about the subject matter that we're going to be talking about today. His name is Kyle Thompson, and he is the host of the Undaunted Life podcast. It's a podcast that I have come across recently, and it has been a help and an encouragement to me. And so I'm very excited to have Kyle on the episode today. So, Kyle, thank you so much for choosing to join with us this week.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. Let's get after it.
Awesome. So what I always like to do is just real quick. You can give us a kind of 10,000 foot overview of your story of coming to faith.
Yeah, so just the brief story is I didn't grow up in a family that went to church at all. There was no discussion of Jesus. We were just Christians by, the fact that we were born on the red dirt of Oklahoma kind of a thing. So
Mm.
if you believe in God, you're a Christian, even if your, Bible has a couple inches of dust on top of it. But I started going to church on my own in junior high because that's where all the good looking girls went to on Wednesday nights. They were at this church near my house. And so I was like, well, that's where I want to be. Because, every now and then they go to pool parties and then they'll be in bathing suits. That was my motivation. And then in 10th grade, there was a hellfire and brimstone preacher that came as a guest preacher on a Sunday night because I would go Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday. Like that was me. Again, no family was taking me. I was just doing it all on my own. And, he's talking about volcanoes and, earthquakes and all this other crazy stuff and all that. And depending upon your background and your language, if you're Calvinist, you'll say in that moment, it was revealed to me that I was elect. Or if you're anything else, it was like, no, I accepted Christ that night. And I,
Right.
started studying my Bible and going through the whole process of beginning my sanctification and all those different things. But that's essentially how I came to faith.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, and praise the Lord for that. Definitely. So I'd like to get into kind of your um, how you got into the Undaunted Life podcast. And I love the theme, the mission of it, equipping men to push back darkness. It's been ever since I heard you interviewed on the Elisa Childers podcast, I have kind of jumped over and been listening to yours. And it's been really encouraging for me and helpful for me. And I'm glad that somebody is talking about this subject. And so, you obviously noticed, at least in some sense, where the church was kind of falling short in the area specifically about men's ministry and how men's ministry is done, and you stepped into that gap. And so I'd like you to kind of share with us where you felt the church was falling short in that area, and how the modern church has how much of the modern church has essentially done a disservice to men in their congregation. So what kind of led into that, and what were the things that you noticed?
Yeah, so a lot there, but going back to 10th grade, I accept Christ and you have a dichotomy as a moron because you're a teenager, right? And it's like, I'm 15 at the time, right? So I know nothing. I'm 10 years away from my brain being fully developed. I'm essentially a chimp at that point. And I'm looking at what it means. I'm learning what it means to become a man. At the same time, I'm learning what it means to become a Christian. And what I notice is that those aren't the same thing. right? All the men
Mm.
are outside the church doing man stuff, and all of the Christians are inside the church, shaking your hand with a limp wrist and telling you they'll pray for you, and they've got their shirts tucked in, and it's like, it's just a different style. And it wasn't until
Right.
I got into my 20s when I was like, wait a minute, like that's a problem. Like the modern church has been emasculated, and a guy like me, with broken nose and cauliflower ears and all that, like I'm attracted to a little bit more of the rougher things of life, if you can say it that way. And I just didn't see a lot of that in the church. And I certainly didn't see Jesus described as a manly man. He always seemed like this kind of wispy haired guy that was going to tell you how much he loved you and, all these things. And yeah, he died for you. And that was pretty rough, but there was no emphasis on the Lion of Judah. Everything was Lamb of God. Everything was grace. Everything was forgiveness. And you can't get a full accounting of who Jesus is if you only see him as Lamb of God. You have to also see him as Lion of Judah. You have to also see him as truth, as the God of the universe, as an angry, just God, like a scary God. Like you have to see all those different things. And so essentially, a very long story short, I was on the YouVersion Bible app because the church I was attending at the time actually invented that app. And I was reading the quote unquote men's devotionals. I was like, these are terrible. These are awful. Like these are women's devotionals that are repackaged to pretend like they're for men. And I told the
Mm.
staff that, and they're like, well, go ahead and write one yourself and see if it gets accepted. So I wrote it. It was accepted, and then I kind of forgot about it. At one point, it was the second most read men's devotional in the on the entire app, only behind Craig Rochelle's, and he's the founder of the church that founded the app. And
Right.
so I think he gets a little bit more marketing push than I do. And so it seemed like there was something there. YouVersion wanted me to write again, but I hate writing. It's like I can do it, like I'm okay at it, but like I hate it. It's just so boring to me. And so the platform that I preferred is where I could just put a few bullet points on a piece of paper and then speak my mind. So that leads to the podcast platform, which is why I launched the show back in 2017, Undaunted Life, a Man's Podcast. And then since then, obviously, I didn't do an interview until episode 100. And, the podcast game has absolutely exploded. I think there were around, less than a million podcasts when I started. Now there's close to 3 million podcasts. And everyone, whether they're talented or even deserve to have a podcast, has a podcast and wants to give you their opinion. And so
Yeah.
it kind of is what it is. But the thing that I've really noticed and what the show's kind of morphed into, and the reason why we tell people, hey, we're here to equip men to push back darkness, is because there's a lot of really dumb, well meaning Christians that will say things like, I want to be known for what I'm for, not what I'm
Mm.
against. And they think
Right.
that's something that Jesus would echo. And the problem is when you communicate that you're for something, you automatically communicate that you're against something, right? So if I
Right.
say I'm for protecting the unborn, I'm also communicating simultaneously that I'm against the destruction, the targeted murderous destruction of the
Mm.
unborn. So, you can put it on a t-shirt and you can say those things in public, but what you're actually communicating is that you're a coward and you don't want to
Mm.
address the difficult social issues because one, you don't have enough time to put in the study to understand them, and two, you're just kind of a wuss. And you think it'll seem unloving if you judge somebody or tell them what they're doing is going to lead to theirs or someone else's destruction. And so I'm trying to push the pendulum back in the other direction a little bit to give Christians the confidence that yes, you can speak into these issues. I'm not giving you license to be a jerk, but what I
Mhm.
am giving you license is to almost be prophetic and speak back and push back against the darkness we see all over the place.
Right. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking of like specific examples that come to mind. And I think you kind of touched on it a little bit, but just the simple idea of judgment. A lot of Christians have kind of taken on the idea like, oh, we don't want to be judgmental, kind of echoing what you said. We just want to be like Jesus. But I mean, Jesus made judgments. Jesus is
He
coming back
made
as the
he
ultimate
Right.
judge.
He made judgments, he made pronouncements. I've said
Mhm.
some pretty incendiary things in my day. Like I talk about transgenderism, I talk about abortion, I talk about immigration. No one gets more mad than whenever I start talking about pit bulls and how basically it's a wild animal and we shouldn't own them as pets. But like the thing about it is I've never made a crowd of people so mad at something that I said that they ran me out of town and tried to kill me and thought about
Mhm.
killing me. That happened to Jesus. So like he was
Right.
basically pushed out of town, and then Jesus, on a cliff was basically like, "No, y'all aren't killing me today," and he just walked out. Like that's
Mhm.
never happened before. So these people that just assume Jesus walked around, what they're ignoring from the scriptures, Ryan, is that every time Jesus said that he loves someone, that was typically after he called them out for their sin directly to their faces. And so it's
Right.
like we're given a biblical mandate. We see this in the Pauline letters of who we are to judge. So we are to judge other Christians the most harshly because those are the ones that should know the book. They should know the Old and New Testament. They should know the laws. They should know what grace and what the gospel actually means. And so I'm not going to be invited over to a Muslim's house for dinner and then chastise them for not praying to Jesus, right? Like that's just
Mhm.
not something that I'm going to do. But you're not judging somebody by saying, "Hey, your chosen lifestyle of homosexuality is it is to your detriment and it hurts the heart of God. Like
Mhm.
that you're sharing with them something that they may not know. They don't know the story of Jesus. They may not even believe in sin, but you're sharing with them like, hey, what you're doing is destroying your own human flourishing and the flourishing of humanity, writ large. So telling them that it's like that, I'm not judging them as much as I'm trying to save them.
Right. Yes. And would you say that that approach, no matter what people think about it and how it makes them feel, is actually more loving than taking the approach
Yes,
of I'm not going
absolutely.
to address a situation?
Absolutely. This idea that helping somebody ignore their sin is loving is ridiculous. It is
Right.
nonsense. Like, think about it this way. Let's say you're the type of person that you're like, if you ever raise your voice, that's unloving. Okay, great. I have a 2-year-old. If he starts taking off towards I-35 and I just go, son, man, I really love you and I've been praying for you. And boom, he gets hit by a semi. Okay. And that moment, I need to raise my voice. I need to scream. I might need to physically snatch him up. Why? Because I love him, because I want him
Mhm.
to be safe, because I want to protect him. So if somebody is doing something that could ultimately lead to their death, whether, temporally on this planet or eternally, why in the world would we not point that out to them? Like, again, we get this idea that in order to love our neighbor, we have to just co sign all their stupid, bad, sinful decisions. And it's the same thing that we see now. We see people saying, yeah, if somebody identifies as the opposite sex, like it's of no value to just not use their chosen name and not use their chosen pronouns. So we're just going to do that because we want to be courteous. It's like, I don't care. If you got on this show today, Ryan, you said, "Hey, my name's Mary." Okay, I don't give a crap. I'll call you Mary. But if you say I use she, her pronouns, it's like, no, I'm sorry. Your choices are not going to make me a liar because I know
Mhm.
that that's not the case, and it would be unloving to me to pretend that you are that thing. I mean, think about it this way, Ryan. There are people out there. Have you heard of furries? Do you know what furries are? These are
I
people
was
that
gonna say,
identify as
sorry.
animals.
Right.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Sorry, there's a little bit of a
Mhm.
lag here, but like these are people that identify as animals. And so, like, if I invite someone over to my house and, husband, wife, and a couple of kids, and one of them identifies as a furry, do I serve everybody dinner on the table, but then give the person a furry? Do I throw their food in the floor and throw them a bowl of water? Would that be a loving thing if I were to take them outside on a leash afterwards so they can go to the bathroom? Is that a loving
Mhm.
thing for me to do? Or would the loving thing be to me like, hey, dad, I need you to get your kid off my floor. This is not a dog. And this isn't, a crazy person's house. Like, this is nonsense. Stop it. And again, that's where we've gotten in our modern culture. It's this whole like American Idol phenomenon. Like, why do we have all these videos of these people that can't sing up there in front of millions and millions of people watching them embarrass themselves? It's because they have a whole bunch of people in their life that don't love them,
Mhm.
that couldn't stop them and say, "Look, John, you're not a good singer. Please do not go to this tryout. This is an embarrassment. They will 100% put you on television, but you will never be able to live this down." It's because people did not love them, not the opposite.
Right. So, why do you think that churches are not taking, when we talk about the area of masculinity and you know um, imploring men to equip themselves to push back darkness and step forward and take the lead, and why is so much of the church fearful to kind of take the approach you're taking to this subject? Why do you think that is?
There could be a lot of reasons, and it's contextual to the actual congregation. So, some examples might be that the pastor is a puss. The pastor is incredibly effeminate and doesn't. He wants to stick to the parts of the Bible that he understands, and that will make everybody feel good. Perhaps they're in growth mode, and you can't grow if you talk about awkward things like sin and money and sex and life choices. Like, you have to just stick to all the Jesus loves you just the way you are, because and without understanding that if you say that, then why did Jesus need to die for you? If he just loved you the way that you were, like that doesn't make a whole
Right.
lot of sense. Those are some examples. You could go back even to something I've talked about before. Go back to the 19th century, and you go back to the Industrial Revolution. You go back to the World Wars. A lot of men were taken out of the homes and taken out of their communities because they were working in factories. They were underground, shaking hands with the devil, trying to get coal out. They were on some godforsaken field in Europe, dying. And so, what was left at these churches were old men, sickly men, weak men, young men, effeminate men. Those are the people that were left, and a whole bunch of women and kids, right? And so, if you're running the music program or if you're running the sermon content, would you not cater to your audience, which now is not dominated by masculine men, but dominated by people that are effeminate? And so, there's a lot of reasons that kind of get us to where we are today, to where it's like almost the overwhelming majority of Christian content is consumed by women. The overwhelming majority of Christian books are bought by women. The overwhelming majority of Christian music that is purchased or listened to on the radio is consumed by women. And so when the music sounds effeminate and when the sermons are have kind of an effeminate bend to it, why are you shocked that you're going to look up one day and look around and all the sheepdogs are gone? And so
Mm,
that's the thing is a lot of churches, if they focus on men's ministry, what they actually mean is men's programming. Once or twice a year, they'll do a men's event. One of them will be a 6 a.m. Saturday morning prayer breakfast, and they're shocked that there aren't more than a dozen people there. And then the other one will be like, oh, they bring in some guest speaker who comes in and burns it down, and then that's it. They basically treat it like church camp, like come in, get your big shot in the arm, which will wear off by Monday, and then you kind of move on with your life. What churches need to move to is a model of making their churches man friendly. Because I don't
mm,
care what kind of programs you put in place. I care about if there are guys like me and guys that are way rougher than me. If they walk into church and they're like, yes, this is a place for me, a place where I can be discipled, a place that I can assist, that I can help grow, that I can help not only catechize my family, but the families all around here, that I can have a true impact. Because the thing with men, and you know this, is if you don't feel necessary, you will go somewhere else where you feel necessary. And so
mm,
on Sunday mornings, a lot of men don't feel necessary at church. They feel like everything about the church communicates to them. We don't want you to be here. We don't have you in mind when we're putting all this stuff together. So guess what? They're going to go to the shooting range. They're going to go to the driving range. They're going to go get ready for their next fantasy football draft. They're going to look at porn and jerk off. They're going to do any number of things aside from the thing that you want them to do, which is apparently to come in, sit in the pews and stare at you and clap whenever you give them the emotional appeal to do so. And so for a lot of men, that's just not really going to sit well with them. And so they're just going to go do something else. And that's partially their fault, but it's certainly partially the church's fault as well.
mm. Interesting. And it was a recent episode that I listened to of your podcast, and forgive me, I forget the guest, but he was the church consultant who
Tom Rayner.
is yes, Tom Rayner, that's his
Yeah.
name. And he even mentioned that a lot of the dying churches that they go to, a large percentage of them, there's the men aren't around.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, and people have tried to dispel this rumor, but back on that book that was written called "Why Men Hate Going to Church," they talked about statistically speaking, if you get the man saved, if you will, right? Sorry, Calvinist, but if
Mhm.
you get the man saved, then that will trickle down to his wife and to his children. It doesn't work
Right.
the opposite way. How many
Yeah.
women go to church by themselves? Because they don't have the ability to force their man to come unless it's on, Christmas or Easter or something like that, or some random day. Oh, hey, our kid's getting baptized today. Can you find it in your schedule to come up here and watch? Like it's that
Right.
type of a mindset. But when you focus on the man and you get the man to understand, his role as and take his role of headship seriously, then that affects the entire family tree. Because if you walk into a family that's rightly ordered, if you walk into their household where the man has taken up the mantle of headship, he's leading and loving his family well, he's showing them, the grace when necessary, and he's showing them the truth and judgment when necessary. That's not an
Mhm.
oppressed family. The woman's not sitting there in the corner with a bonnet on, cooking, hoping to God she doesn't get smacked again. The kids aren't walking around waiting for dad to freak out. That's not the situation at all. They feel loved. They feel vibrant. They're full of life, and they also understand why they're doing the positive things in life that they are doing, because everything good comes from the Lord, and they understand that those good things need to be directed back towards him. And so it's this idea that we figured something out in modernity that we can do it a better way. It's like the model has been set forth for us millennia and millennia ago to pretend as if or this chronological snobbery, as C.S. Lewis would call it, in 2023, that we've, stumbled on the Rosetta Stone on how to have a great family. It's like, yeah, y'all can keep going the secular direction and see how that works out for you.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. We tend to think that whatever's modern is good and whatever's old is archaic, I guess, eh?
Sure. Chronological
Yeah,
chronological snobbery. It's of all the things, excuse me, of all the amazing things that C.S. Lewis said, that's one of the most incredible ones because it's applicable no matter when you read it.
right, absolutely. Let's talk about for a second toxic masculinity and your thoughts on that. How much of this has been, we just talked about modernity and our current cultural climate. How much of the influence of, I guess, the lack of masculine forward ministries or men centered ministries, how much of that has been impacted by the movement of extreme feminism?
What is toxic masculinity?
That is a good question because I don't think that it's something that's real and that exists. I think that when you talk about toxic masculinity, I'm not talking about opening the door for a woman as she walks through. I'm not talking about training up your children to or your sons to be protectors of women. That's not toxic. Like in my perspective, if you're talking about something that's toxic, you're just talking about a guy that's being sinful, a guy that's using his his God-given design for 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 self
Yeah,
gratification.
so
For
let's start from there. Let's use that as our
yes,
jumping off point. So you
yeah,
and I would agree that a toxically masculine man is a man that is using his musculature, which comes from the testosterone that he was given as a gift, to
mhm,
subdue and to hurt women and children. I think that we would
right,
agree that that was toxic. We would
yes,
agree that, in you can extrapolate out from there. I think people get the point. But
mhm,
culturally, we don't do that because we live in a second, third, fourth wave, now going into fourth wave feminist culture that would say masculinity in and of itself is toxic. So holding a door open for a woman is somehow toxic. So there's a story that I remember a pastor talking about years ago, and I'll get some of the details wrong, but the gist of it is right. So everybody remembers the Aurora, Colorado shooting where, during the Dark Knight movie, guy walks in with firearms and shoots people, kills a bunch of people, in cold blood. Everybody remembers that story. Something that people maybe don't realize about that story is there were three young men that died that night when they were covering the bodies of their girlfriends to shield them from the bullets.
mm,
Notice how I didn't say wives. I didn't say daughters. I didn't say mothers, grandmothers, aunts, cousins, nieces, sisters, none of that. They're girlfriends, right? Like they didn't have any legally binding thing. They hadn't made a covenant before God to protect, and care for these women. It was just their girlfriends. And they were universally seen as heroes because they
mhm,
protected these women with their bodies and thus sacrificed their own. Now, around that same time, again, the details are a little fuzzy, but the gist of it is true. There was like a small, like little cruise liner ship type of thing. I think it may have been in the Mediterranean. Something went wrong with the ship. The ship was sinking, and kind of there was a little bit of a Titanic situation going on. They didn't have enough lifeboats on board for everybody to be saved. And what they found later, after certain people died and certain people survived, is that a lot of the men on board were on the lifeboats, and they were actually pushing women and children off so that they didn't capsize the little lifeboats, basically preserving and taking care of themselves, right? And they were universally decried as cowards, as
mhm,
evil, toxic men. But if you have a secular worldview, this postmodern materialist worldview, again, we're all just, highly evolved chimps that used to be fish, that used to be goo, that used to be stardust or whatever. You can't make that claim that the
mhm,
men in the movie theater were heroes and the men, on the lifeboats were not that. Like you can't make that claim because we live in a survival of the fittest model, right? And so
right,
a true believer, fourth wave feminist should say that the men that covered the bodies of their girlfriends in those theaters, that they robbed them of the opportunity to be murdered as well, because that is unequal and bigoted and terrible. But they would never say that.
mm,
And then those people should also say that bravo to those men that were able to, basically give those women equal opportunity to try to make it on those lifeboats because men and women are essentially the same. Do you see how ridiculous and vapid a worldview like that is? But the thing
yeah,
about it is, I think they know that, but they know that their ideology can't lean them that direction. I just can't believe that somebody is so obtuse in their brain that they can't understand that. And so a lot of it comes down to when someone's like, well, that's just being toxically masculine. It's like, what do you mean? It define toxic masculinity for me because typically until a few years ago, words had meaning and
right,
they had meaning because they were agreed upon. Like everyone agrees that this is a microphone, that this is a mouse to an Apple computer, that that's a phone, that that's a camera, that that's a light. We all have agreements because that's how words need to work if they're going to work in polite society. But now, again, downstream of postmodernism, your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth, and we just kind of make it up as we go along.
right. Now I want to talk about something that how some guys might respond to to kind of this subject and whatnot, who might feel like I don't know, maybe they're not as masculine, however we would define masculine, as like the next guy or whatever. Like I don't know, they're not necessarily they don't like to work out, they don't like to, I don't know, hunt. I'm just kind of throwing things out there. Maybe they're kind of more like nerdy. Maybe they like music and arts. They like to cook. And how do we define kind of masculinity biblically. And I'm not saying every kind of a cultural standard of masculinity is wrong, because there are cultural standards of masculinity that are rooted in truth. But just kind of getting an understanding of how we look at masculinity biblically. And so, can you kind of unpack that for us?
Yeah, so you're talking about the difference between biblical masculinity and caricature masculinity. And so how I would unpack that is we have a definition of what a man is at Undaunted Life. It's a male, which you shouldn't even have to define that, but here we are, a male that cultivates spiritual, mental, and physical resilience daily. Okay.
Mm.
Now there's a lot there that we don't have time to really unpack. If anybody's, listened to my show, you've probably heard me unpack that before. Caricature masculinity is hunts, fights, drinks beer, has a beard, like loves cigars, chases women, has a four-wheel drive truck covered in dirt, like all, that kind of stuff, right? And I happen to check all those boxes, right? Like I except for beer, beer's gross, whiskey's amazing, but it's like I don't I don't check some of the typical masculine boxes, but I do check a lot of them. But I don't care what you're into. Like, I
Mm.
don't care if you're more of a nerd and you'd rather spend your Saturday night, fixing a motherboard on some sort of computer tower, whereas I like to go to the gym and get, try to not get strangled by a bunch of gorillas. Like, that's fine. Like, we can have our different interests. If you're a little bit more stoic, if you're a little bit more artistic, if you're a little bit all those different things, but guess what? That doesn't give you license to be soft.
Mm.
Because one thing that we know in modernity is that we have completely misjudged the way the word meek is supposed to be used. Because we
Right.
see the meek shall inherit the earth. We think the weak willed, the weak hearted, the, navel gazer. Yeah, here, you go ahead, I'll get the next one. That type of thing. It's like, no, 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 no. That is not what meek means at all. What meekness is knowing how to use violence and power but having it under voluntary control, right? So the
Mm.
way Jordan Peterson has described it is it's having a sword, knowing how to use it, but leaving it sheathed, right? And so the reality is a weak man that is incapable of exerting power and violence is not a virtuous man. He's a useless man. Because guess what? If someone comes into my home and they try to hurt my wife and my two young sons, what's more virtuous? Me opening up my Bible and trying to have a Bible study with that man that's trying to violate my family or to stop them? Because if you read the Bible in context and if you look at things across the board, it is incumbent upon me to try to protect image bearers of Christ that are currently being violated by the wolf. That is why I train, right? So everything works backwards from that. Why do I train my body? So I can be strong enough to subdue somebody. Why do I train in fighting? So that I could potentially subdue somebody just with my body. Why do I train with weapon systems? Why do I do any of those things? For those purposes. Now, that's a lot of physical stuff, but at the same time, you have people that have the physical boxes checked, but they've never hit their knees and prayed to God for their wives and children, for their
Mm.
protection, for their salvation. They've never done that. Like mentally, they haven't read a book since high school because they've been convinced that if they read a book, they're a nerd somehow. So you see how like spiritual, mental, physical resilience. These are all things that men need to work towards, and that doesn't have anything to do with your hobbies.
Mm. Awesome. What in your opinion could churches be doing better to help minister to men right now? What could a church start implementing that could just be, yeah, to be able to kind of cultivate those things in the men in their church?
So the two ones that come to mind that are the easiest, and this seems like it doesn't seem like there's a lot here, but I promise there is for the person that's the lead teacher, which is typically the senior pastor, and for the person that is in charge of the music, is to have the men in mind when you do your job.
Mm.
So I had a worship leader a year or two back sent me an email. It was after an episode where I basically, went hard on contemporary Christian music and, said it's basically, I think it was called Contemporary Christian Music is for Women and Effeminate Men. That's what was the name of the episode. Got a lot of play, got shared around. So there was a worship leader that sent me an email out of the blue and I was like, oh, here we go. I'm about to get dressed down by this guy. And he was like, dude, I've been doing this for a very long time and I've never once considered the men in the songs that I chose. I didn't
Mm.
consider the men in the lyrical choices, in the keys that I would pick to sing the song in, like a key that a man could probably get. I would always look out in the crowd and it was the women and the, more emotive men that were the, praising and singing and all that. And it was all the kind of more stoic, tough guys that were just sat there with their hands in their pockets looking like they were waiting for it to be over because they are. And so he's
mm,
like, it wasn't until I listened to this episode that I was like, oh my gosh, I've been messing up all these years. I need to keep the men in mind. I need to understand that the men are going to be more attracted to the warlike cries of the Psalms as opposed to what's in, top 40 Christian radio right now. And so that was one thing. But the same thing with these churches, your pastor doesn't have to do a 4 to 8 week sermon series on biblical masculinity once a year to show people what biblical masculinity is. He needs to show it himself.
mm,
And so, like, if you're a pastor out there and you're 100 pounds overweight and you're really, really soft and you have no calluses on your hands, is that really what you're supposed to be doing right now? Because I know from scripture we see that physical strength is of some value, but it's not of no value, right?
mm,
The same thing would be true as imagine being a pastor and never like having zero prayer life and you don't study the Bible at all. Like if you're trying to show people how to be a good man, you have to model it yourself because you know how it goes. There's the people that are like, oh, do as I say, not as I do. It's a whole lot more impactful when someone says, do what I say because of what I do, right?
mm,
Like I'm showing you what this looks like because I don't come from a long line of manly men, a long line of men that are taking care of their bodies and taking care of their health and take care of their women. That's just not my family tree. But
mm.
that's how I'm going to teach my two young boys to be as biblically and toxically masculine as possible and how they should operate in this world. I have to do it by modeling. So, to those people out there, to those churches that are listening to this, if you're not modeling it from the pulpit, and if you're not modeling it behind your acoustic guitar, then don't be surprised when you don't have a bunch of sheepdogs around.
Right. Absolutely, for sure. Well, Kyle, we're kind of reaching the end of our kind of our time frame here, and man, I really I could keep talking about this. I really love this subject, and I'm really thankful for the work that you do, and I'm thankful that you're going forward strong with this subject. We need more Christian men to be doing this, and I'm just very thankful for it. And before we go, can I just give you an opportunity to plug all of your work and what you're doing, and we'll list everything in the show notes below so people can find your work as well.
Yeah, we'll make it simple. So our website is www.undaunted.life. So you can get to the podcast from there. We have devotionals. We have some resources for abortion and different things like that. So all that's there on our website and anywhere you listen to podcasts. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts. Just search Undaunted Life, a man's podcast, or just Undaunted Life, or just Kyle Thompson. You can find us. The big thing that I will tell people is we don't have like this cabal of people sending us a bunch of dirty money so that we can do what we do. We're able to pull off what we do because we have donors. And that's really the only way we're able to pull off what we do. We get a little money from advertising, but not much. And so, guys, if you like the content that we produce, if you want to see more content like this, if you want to help us equip more men around the globe to be able to push back darkness, we do have a donation page on our website, undaunted.life/donate. Everything we got guys giving $10 a month all the way up to a few $100 a month and big donors here and there. And like you have no idea how important that is to what we're trying to do on a day in, day out basis.
Awesome. And I want to encourage the listener to check out Undaunted Life. It's been an encouragement to me. And I think whether you're a guy or whether you're a girl, Kyle covers subjects that are applicable for you, the Christian. And I just want to encourage you all to go check that out. So thank you so much for joining with us, Kyle. I really, really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Ryan.
So I hope you guys enjoyed that interview today. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you have any questions for me, as always, send me an email to ryanhomespodcast@gmail.com. If you are on the YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell to be notified for all of our latest content. And ultimately, please share this podcast and let's encourage others to think about their faith and live it out. See you next time.